Hi, I'm making a game about a sad Mars rover. Last time I went into detail about how Perry would move and the programming behind that, and just generally showed my incompetence. And this time I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Well, I'll show different things, but I'll still be incompetent. So Perry's job on this planet is to terraform it, but to do that she'll need to collect dirt samples and she'll need to plant seeds so that they grow when the terraforming begins. So this episode I'm going to go into how I've programmed her tank, placing samples, and a few other things that I've done quite badly. To wit, the first thing is that this episode will be slightly different to the first one in that I use source control. It's kind of like save files in a video game, so I can go back and show you my progress when I started and then incrementally show you what I've been working on. The problem is that it's very confusing and it can smell fear, and God knows I am terrified of it. So basically, it broke everything, so I can't go back and show you from where I was working on it, so we're just going to have to go from where I'm at now. So with that in mind, prepare yourself to be looking at something quite different from where we left off last time. The first thing is that I remodeled Perry. Like I say, I'm great at building squares, but I thought why not make a square with an extra edge? She's a bit thicker and I think it just makes her look a bit more fit for purpose and a bit more cute. I hope you agree, but if you don't, I also decided it was time to take my mother's advice and stop playing around with balls, and instead I've made some terrain for us to test on. Just a little bit. Just a smidge. Now flying around on this terrain just gives us a better idea of how Perry will perform flying on different kinds of terrain, different hills, and help me tweak the movement a bit. And also do some sick jumps. Did you see that? Now before we get onto the sampling, there is a small thing I added to the player controller, which is I want there to be storms on this planet, so that when you're flying around, you don't just have an easy time of it, because you said space travel was easy, right? So if I tick this button here, then a storm will kick up and it will push Perry in this direction. I could change the direction, but this is the one it's going in for now. And this is going to make it a bit harder on some of those more important levels. Now, the other thing is that I don't want to be completely unfair, so if you hide behind something, you can see this ray. Oh god, I'm a bit too far away for the ray to hit the thing. But you can see this ray fires out in this direction of the storm, and if I am behind something, then I'm no longer affected by the force of it. Now this was achieved very simply. Just in the update function we check if there is a storm, and if there is, we send a raycast out in the direction the storm is coming from. And so if the ray doesn't hit anything, then we add a force in that direction. So at the moment it's applying equally to the X and Z directions. And I can also change the direction of the storm, so if I press this button, then she really flies. Like really flies. Jesus. Next up we have the tank. As you can see here we have a position which I can change with the arrow keys, so currently we're in position 0, and then if I was actually clicked on the game, nice one, there you go, you can see it going up to 2 and then rolling back around, because there are only 3 positions and programmers count from 0 because we really like to say actually. So if I set these samples to be 1, that means that there is a sample in this slot that can be placed. And next up we need to go to a sample area, and oh look, there's one over here. How fortuitous. Isn't that lucky? Now when I enter this sample area, on the player you can see that it now says we are interactable, which means that the sample button now works. So if I press J, then a plant spawns inside Perry and freaks her the hell out. Because wouldn't you freak out? And each sample area has a sample size, which means that you only need to place a certain number of samples before this area is satisfied. So if I spawn one sample, tiny little freak out, but not too bad. Spawn a second sample. Oh, I'm not in the right position. Position 2. Well, position 1, but programmers. And then finally, position 3. And the sample area has destroyed itself, and we have these lovely samples floating in the air, like good little plants. Now dirt works slightly differently because the player will have to actually find them in the world and then collect them. And as you can see here, we've got 2 incredibly accurate cubes, which are of course how dirt looks in the real world. Or I've been playing too much Minecraft. But if I hover over a piece of dirt, you can see on the player controller I'm interactable, as long as I stay over it. Bad Perry. Oh, we're going to fall into the next one. So I'm interactable. Come on, Perry. So I'm interactable. Come on. Interactable. Almost. Interactable. And if I press J, come on. There we go. You can see that sample 0 now has a sample. Now I will concede this is a bit fiddly to begin with, but that's because I've left colliders on these and so the hovering is bouncing off them, but that won't be the case in the final game. But the plant spawning inside Perry, yeah, that's a feature. These samples work very simply. All that happens is if the player enters their collider, then they have a reference set to the current sample they are over, and if they leave, then they can no longer interact with it. And when the player does interact with it, then they will be removed and add themselves to the player. And if the player is interactable in the player controller, then we will check if our current sample isn't null, which means that there is a current sample we're over, and so we want to add that sample to the tank. Otherwise, if the current sample area isn't null, then that means we are in a sample area, and so we can place a sample. In that case, then we call place sample in the tank, and we iterate how many samples have been taken. The sample area works much the same way as the sample does, in that if we have a player enter the collider, then we set them to be interactable, but we also need to iterate how many samples have been taken if somebody places one. This is a badly named method, it should be placed. But you know, you can't be surprised by me being stupid at this point. And then finally, if we have enough samples that we've satisfied the sample size, then we remove the sample area. Simple. Now the tank itself is quite simple. We simply have 3 samples and a position the player is currently in. If the player wants to move their position, then we just change that by the direction they press the arrow keys, and if we get to 2 or to 0, then we roll back around. And if we're adding a sample to the tank, then we call add sample at next position, which finds the next available position in the tank and just sets that sample to be the sample we're currently taking before we remove it from the world. And if we're placing a sample, then we call place sample at position, which finds if there is a sample at that position, and if there is, sets it to be the temporary sample and sets the current sample slot that it was in to be empty now. Then finally we instantiate that sample at our current position and rotation, because that's a good idea. Now there's one job we haven't covered quite yet with samples, and that is that plants will need fertilizing. But Perry can't carry fertilizer herself, her tank is just made for carrying solid objects. So Perry will need to tow an object. Like this object. Isn't that great? It's another high resolution model from myself, and it just gets pulled along. Now there will be several hovering objects that will be pulled along by Perry in this game, but this is the fertilizer, which has another function. See, if we look at one of these plant samples here, we can see that they are currently not fertilized. But if I were to fly my fertilizer over the top of them, and then press the interact button, then they are now fertilized. Easy as that. This works in pretty much the same way that harvesting a sample does. You can see that the fertilizer controller has an interactable boolean, and so if I'm over a sample, then it becomes interactable, and we have the current sample here. And if I fertilize it, then the charges goes down from 3 to 2. Now this is all good and well, I hear you saying, but how do I know what I'm meant to do in the level? Well, I'm still talking, so shut up. So to give the player objectives, I have created a level controller. This object is in charge of handling objectives and the order that they are played in, as well as talking to the UI controller so that we can show text on screen depending on the objective. Now the level controller at its core is a list of objectives, and at the start we go through each of the objectives, and if there aren't any prerequisites to that objective being active, then we start that objective. And then every frame we check if each of the objectives is completed, and if they are, then we end them and remove them from the list. And finally, if we run out of objectives, then we call final quest, which will set as a final quest up to return to the home base, set that quest text, and set end level to true, so that we don't keep calling this over and over and over and over. Now the simplest of the two objectives is the area objective, which simply means we need to reach a certain area. So when the objective starts, we set the objective area to be active, and we queue up any dialogue if there's any needed, and we update the UI. And when it ends, if there's any dialogue, we show it, and if we want, we can remove a towable object. So if you reach somewhere with, I don't know, a satellite or something like that, then we can set that object to be inactive. And also, if we want a storm to begin when you reach a certain area, then we can set that here as well. And finally, if there were any objectives that needed this one to be completed first, then we start that before finally removing the UI from this quest. Now the sample objective is a little more complicated. When we start, we first need to determine what kind of sample objective this is. Are we placing samples, are we harvesting, or are we fertilizing? If the sample type of the objective is 0 or 2, that means that there are multiple samples that we'll need to reference because there isn't an objective area we need to place them in. So we get all of the components from the children, and we set the samples needed from that, so we can do it dynamically. Otherwise that means we are placing samples, and so all we need to do is to set the connected objective up and other references like that. So similarly to the area objective, when this objective starts we set the objective area to be true, but also we need to set all of the child items to be true if there are any. Then we queue up any dialogue, and then finally we update the UI with the objective text. Now for sample objectives, we don't just write in text into the inspector, we actually generate a script based on how many samples we have currently sampled, how many are needed, what kind of sample it is so we know if we're collecting, harvesting, fertilizing, and that way we can build the string dynamically. And similarly, if the objective ends, then we show any dialogue if there is any dialogue afterwards, and we start any objectives that need this one to be completed first, and finally remove this quest. But because this quest has progression, you don't just complete it by doing a single thing, then we need to update the objective if something happens. So if this method is called, then we pass through the sample type of the sample that has just been interacted with. So if it is the correct sample type, then we iterate how many samples have been sampled, and then we check if the sample sampled is enough to meet the samples needed, and if so, then we set it to be completed. God, that sounds like a really rubbish poem. So what this means in game is that you can see in the top left corner here that it says reach the area. Which area exactly? This area. This will all be polished up. I know that there's no like in-world indicators yet, but there will be. Oh look, dialogue, Steve McQueen. Great, you know how to move. Now go collect some samples. Thank you, Steve McQueen. As you can tell, I am a brilliant writer as well as a brilliant modeler, and brilliant game designer in general. Now you can see collect 2 samples up here, so if we collect 1, then that increases, and then if we collect 1 more, if I'm not incompetent, and collect 1 more, sorry, be right back, I'm going to beat my head in. There we go. If we collect 1 more objective, then we get this text up here. That's just some placeholder text, but that just means that we have completed all of the objectives. Now the UI for this is a bit confusing, and I'm still not 100% sure I know how this works, but essentially, if we get a call to update the UI and we don't have a quest holder prefab, which is just a text box that I've made, we create one, we assign the text needed, like before we build the string from the sample type, the progress, and how many samples we need left. So then we set its parent to be the canvas, and we add it to the UI controller's quest holders list. And then after that, we arrange the quests so that we don't have multiple that are in the same spot. They will spawn and then be placed one after the other after the other. Now because this is a sample objective, it's possible to update the UI without needing to create a new one, so we have this check here, so then if we do already have one, then we just need to update the string again. Meanwhile for the area objective, well, this will only need to be called once, so we just do all of those steps and just set the quest text to be the quest text. And then if we finish the quest, then we set the objective's quest holder to be null, just basically remove all the references to it before destroying it, and then rearrange the quests so that they're all aligned again. Now in the UI controller, this part is relatively simple. Basically all we do is we go through each quest in our quest holders list, and for each of those we set its position to be 0 on the X, 0 on the Z. On the Y, we simply multiply how far we want the quest to be spaced out by the iterative value that we are on currently in this list. So each time we go through, I will become a little bit more, and then we can space them out more. Now, as you might have noticed, if you're even slightly watching the video, there is dialogue that has appeared at the bottom here after completing the first go-to area quest. Now this is set in the inspector. You can see under the area objective script I have written the name Steve McQueen, and I've written this beautiful piece of Shakespeare, which from a code point of view we'll call queue dialogue in the level controller. When the dialogue is queued, we simply use a function called enqueue that I didn't know existed until Brackeys told me. Once we queued up all of the lines of dialogue into a list, then we pass that list to the UI and call start dialogue. Now when we start the dialogue, we set the player to be in the dialogue state so that they no longer move and that the dialogue button is accepted. Then we clear the previous queue, and we set the dialog box to active before calling next line. And in next line, first off we check if we've reached the end of the dialogue, which we shouldn't have by the first go round, otherwise something's got seriously wrong. And then we just set the text box to be the current line. And then in the player controller we have a check for if we are in dialogue, and if we are, then we use the boost button, which is the spacebar, to call the next line once the player is done reading. Now the astute of you might have noticed that this is in its own little update function, not the fixed update function. Now the reason for that is that the fixed update is called a certain interval, not every frame. So if it was in the fixed update, you'd have to get really lucky to tap the spacebar on the time that was called. Now putting it in the update means that it's called every frame instead of at a certain constant rate, which means that you will always press it on a frame, so that way the game doesn't eat your input. And that's all I'm going to show for this video. I have done a few extra little bits that I'm going to save for next time, But looking at where I'm at, I've basically got a full game, right? There can't be much more to do. Surely. Surely.